We've had some Big Firouzja news confirmed this week, which is that he will be playing in the Grand Chess Tour this year, with the first event starting in Bucharest, Romania on the 3rd of May. After that, there's Norway Chess, which he'll likely be playing in like he's done the last couple of years, although the players aren't confirmed yet for that. And then in June, we've got the candidates coming up to decide who will be Magnus Carlsen's next challenger in early 2023. So I'm looking back today at a game that Firouzja played last year in the Grand Chess Tour. This was Paris Blitz, so this is a Blitz game. It was played against Vladimir Kramnik, former world champion, phenomenal player, playing in the white pieces. I'd be quaking in my boots. Let's see what Firouzja did here. Playing with the black pieces, and he goes for this really fighting Najdorf variation, always exciting to see on the board. So after these standard opening moves, pawn a6, this is the Najdorf, and here Kramnik goes pawn to a4. There are many moves for white in that position, but he goes for this one. We saw Tari play this same way against Firouzja in Norway Chess 2021. I covered that game on the channel, I'll link it at the end. And there Firouzja went pawn to e5, kicking this knight back. Today, or in this game anyway, last year, he went pawn to g6, playing in a dragon style variation. So the bishop came to e2, it covers this g4 square, you don't want a knight g4 later. So after bishop g7, then we had bishop e3 after both players castled, and this is why you don't want knight g4. Now we had knight c6. Now white doesn't capture here usually, you just help black by bringing a pawn towards the centre, you open the b file, not what you want. So instead Kramnik continues developing with queen to d2, we had bishop to d7, Firouzja does similar, and now Kramnik brings his f rook to the d file here. Just to note, you might wonder about say pawn f4 here. The problem with this is you leave e4 quite weak, you really want that pawn on f3, because it's quite hard to actually go f5, let's say, you give up the e5 square, and e5 is tough to achieve, it's covered by two pieces, say rook c8, now if you come here, captures to try e5, well you're not in time because the knight's coming to e4, not what you want as white. So Kramnik understands that that's not the right plan. He brings a rook to the d file, we had rook to c8, and now pawn to f3, bolstering that centre. And now Firouzja has a couple of options here. One standard plan is to bring the knight to a5 or even e5, looking to then come into c4. He also wants to play queen a5 here. And I mentioned why he didn't play this first. He played rook e8 because if he'd played queen a5 immediately, then the knight could take on c6, the bishop recaptures, and knight d5 can come. Now these queens are staring at each other. So say you take here, you have to do something, your queen's undefended. There's an in-between move, takes with check. This is the problem with this whole variation. So that's why Firouzja goes here, after pawn to f3, rook e8, covering the e7 pawn, preparing queen a5. And now Kramnik plays a bit slowly really. I think he should take on c6 now. There's no pawn captures or you lose the a6 pawn. So the bishop would recapture, and now you can go pawn to a5, stopping the queen from coming out. You've opened the d file for your heavy pieces, the bishop could come to d4, but instead he plays bishop to f1 here. It's just a little bit slow, because now Firouzja goes knight to e5 here, so he's looking at this square, and again Kramnik really had to go pawn a5 here, stop the queen from jumping out here. Instead he goes pawn b3. Looks nice to stop the knight from hitting c4, but you weaken the dark squares quite fatally here. So queen a5 comes, immediately hitting this knight twice now, you have to do something, and best here would have been knight d5 actually. Again the queens come off like this, and after black captures here, the pawn recaptures. Black's now equalised, but at least we don't have the knight sitting on e2, blocking the bishop. What we'll see in the game is that after queen a5, the knight instead dropped back here, but the pieces are just getting a bit on top of each other now. We can see these ones are blocked, especially the bishop. So now we had the queens coming off, and pawn to d5 was played. And this is an excellent break for black. If you can achieve d5 in the Najdorf, you're usually doing quite well. Now, one thing to mention here, so Kramnik captured, if you try pawn f4, you give up this g4 square, and it's just too problematic tactically. If you go e5, then we just jump in here, and this one can always reroute like this if needed. And if you immediately kick that knight with h3, well then e5 is really powerful. Won't go through all the lines, but black is doing well. Anyway, so Kramnik understands this. He didn't go f4, he took on d5, the knight recaptured, and there was a lot of pressure down the c file as we can see. This is a backwards pawn, this square is sensitive, so c4 was played to kick that knight. It dropped back here, but the challenge now for white is to make these pawns into an asset and not a liability. And here I think Kramnik's instincts let him down. So he's just made a pawn push, and now he makes a further pawn push with pawn to a5. But I think he really had to go bishop c3 immediately, stop the knight from hopping into d3, and play with his pieces, not his pawns. Instead, after knight f6, he goes pawn to a5, but this allows knight d3. Now the bishop came to c3, uncovering this attack, but it hopped into c5 now, and there's a lot of pressure against this b3 pawn. There's a threat to go e5, kick this knight away, then take the pawn. So b4 was now played by Kramnik, but again, it's a real overextension of these pawns now. They're becoming very, very weak, because although you kick the pieces around, you've now given up the a4 square, and the knight begins attacking this bishop. And the rook also attacks this weakened c4 pawn. And you can't defend that pawn with your bishop, because if you move this knight away, well then you drop the bishop on c3 here. So that's why pawn c5 was played. Kramnik kept on kicking on those pawns, but that now gave up the d5 square, and Firouzja's building up a huge initiative now. So the bishop is attacked twice, it retreated to d2, now knight b2 came, hitting the rook. It slid away to the b file, and knight c4 was played, hitting this bishop. So rook a2 defended, but now pawn to e5 came, driving that knight back, and the bishop came to f5, hitting the other rook. That one came to d1, and now simply knight takes on d2 was played, and after the rook recaptured, Firouzja wins this critical b pawn here, which now weakens these ones as well. And now Kramnik finally got knight g3 in, bringing that piece back into the game slightly, opening up his bishop. So Firouzja dropped his bishop back, hitting this knight. We can see it doesn't have any jumps, it's a really bad piece. So it was defended like this, and now pawn to f5 was played. Beautiful stuff, just paralysing both of the knights here. They've got no jumps that are any good. So we had knight c1 now, really horrible stuff. But this does open an attack down the b file on this knight, on this pawn behind it. So how would you play in this position? Can you find the best continuation? And if you want to pause it, please do so. So here Firouzja played bishop to h6, a beautiful move. Bishop to f8 was also good. You're coming onto this dark square diagonal basically, but this is even more powerful because you hit this rook, you x-ray the knight behind it, so you don't have time to take here or you lose the rook. So the rook moved away, it came into d6, and now we had this check here on e3, the king moved away, the bishop took here, and this is just awful for white now, as we can see. You're 2 pawns down, your pieces are getting kicked all over the place. So Kramnik actually took here, just trying to mix up the position, so that after rook recaptures, bishop c4 came, but Firouzja calmly defends, king to f7. This knight now came to e2. We had bishop e7, uncovering this attack. So the bishop captured here, the king recaptured, pawn to h3 was played. It's difficult to find good moves. We had rook to c2 now, pressuring the knight, threatening f4, and rook to e1 defended and also set up a sneaky trap. So if you go f4 now and play too casually, you're running into knight d4 check, taking advantage of this pin, and you're actually losing your rook here. White has equalized the position. So you always have to be careful in such positions. So king f7 played, stepping off the e-file here, and Kramnik can hardly make a move now, so he dropped this knight back to c1. We had bishop to h4 hitting this one, the knight came meekly back, and now pawn to f4 hits that knight, x-rays the rook behind, so the rook counterattacked here, but now the bishop took here anyway. You don't have time to take here, or we simply capture this piece. Black's a piece up, completely winning. And if you take the bishop here like this, well, now we can capture with the pawn, and again you don't have time to capture, or this is actually checkmate. If you enjoyed this game, then do click here to see Firouzja playing Tari, and thanks very much for watching. See you soon.